everybody, Fran here at New Testament Explained. Today's video is going to look at the genealogy in the Gospel of Matthew, and this aligns with topic 1.1, prophecies regarding the Messiah, if you are studying Edexcel A-level religious studies and in particular the New Testament option. So before we look at Matthew's genealogy in his Gospel, I just want to make sure that everybody's clear on what we mean by the term genealogy. So genealogy is a term that means a line of descent traced continuously from an ancestor. So it's where you look at an individual's ancestry. So commonly we kind of associate them often with family trees. So the idea that you take an individual and you look back through their parents' line as to their ancestors. So people they're related to in the distant past. Matthew's Gospel starts with a genealogy of Jesus, and therefore what his Gospel does is it traces back his family, and in particular what it does, it goes through, well, back through the line of David and then back even further to Abraham. So again, that is Matthew in his Gospel at the beginning giving us, or giving his reader, a genealogy, a list of Jesus' ancestry and ultimately individuals he has come from in terms of his family. Mona Hooker is a scholar who points out that the word Matthew uses for his genealogy is actually the word Genesis, which is really interesting, therefore, because what it tells us is that Matthew began his Gospel with a sort of new Genesis, just like the first book of the Old Testament. So we kind of get this idea of a new beginning. So in summary, genealogy is essentially where you look at somebody's ancestry. Matthew does this for Jesus at the beginning of his Gospel, and in particular looks at how he is connected to the line of David and to Abraham. And Mona Hooker points out that the word Matthew uses for this genealogy is quite interesting in terms of what he's trying to tell us. So now that we're clear on what genealogy means, we're going to look at what Matthew's genealogy says. Now, in the Gospel of Matthew, the genealogy is written in continuous prose, which means it is written in full sentences. But what I have done here to make it easier for us to discuss, or me to talk through, is I have popped it in a table format. Now, the first interesting point about this genealogy is that it is organised into 3 sections of 14. So the first section of 14 runs from Abraham down to King David. The second section of 14 runs through David's royal line down to the Babylonian exile in 597 BCE. And then the final section is from the Babylon through until Jesus. Now, a question we might have at that point is why? Why has Matthew organised this into sections of 14? And the answer is a little bit up for debate here. Some scholars suggest that the reason for this is 14 is the number 7 doubled, and the number 7 is highly significant in Judaism. It's a number that is considered a symbol for all association with God and is therefore seen as the divine number of completion. So it could be making inferences about Jesus kind of ending a process and being that completion. A second potential reason for this is that David, if you use the gematria number system, which is something I would Google if you're not sure of, it's not something I would expect one to be familiar with, the numerical value of David is 14. So it could perhaps be a link there also. So in a nutshell, there is no definite answer as to why this genealogy is divided into 3 sections of 14, but scholars have proposed potential reasons why this is the case. The final thing I want to point out about this genealogy in terms of what is interesting Actually, there's 2 points left. One of the final 2 points I want to make is that Raymond E. Brown has studied this genealogy, and what he thinks is very interesting is that it seems to appeal to two audiences at the same time. A Jewish audience would be interested in Jesus being connected through his ancestry to King David. As we've studied in this topic before, there is an expectation that the Messiah will come from the line of David. But for a Gentile audience, remember Gentile means non-Jewish audience, the link to Abraham would be very interesting, because in Genesis 12:3 we get that God had promised a descendant of Abraham who would bring a blessing to all people. So a Gentile audience would be interested by that connection. And then on to the final point that is interesting about this genealogy is that Matthew looks at Joseph's line. So if you look at the bottom of the third column, it goes Jesus 14, but then 13 is Joseph, and it kind of continues up through his family, which is really interesting, because you would expect, especially given the sort of nativity story and the conception of Jesus, you would expect this genealogy to go through the mother's line, Mary's line. We're going to discuss that more in a minute, but there are essentially 3 points of interest here. The organisation into 3 sections of 14, the fact that this genealogy would be appealing perhaps to 2 different audiences, Jewish and Gentile. And the third point of interest is that this genealogy looks at an ancestry through the line of Joseph and not through Mary. So the last thing we're going to look at as part of Matthew's genealogy is problems that scholars have identified with the genealogy, and then we're going to look at counter-arguments that might suggest either that the problem is not important or that there is an answer to that problem. So the first problem is that Matthew's genealogy does not match up with the line of David, and what we mean by that is it's inaccurate and kings have been missed out. So people are missing off this genealogy who should be on it. A counter-argument, and this is an explanation as to why these people might be missing, is that it might be down to dependence on Old Testament information circulated in a popular context, so it's not coming through archives. And what you might get as a result of this process of getting information is errors and omissions. So there is just perhaps a chance it wasn't done deliberately. It might have been a reflection of the material Matthew had access to when writing this. A second reason why this might be the case though is that the kings who have been omitted might be have been considered wicked kings, and therefore Matthew may have wanted to take them off because of his knowledge of what they were like and perhaps not wanting that association. Problem number 2 then is that there are not, if you look at the years between the individuals listed on the genealogy, there's not 14 generations. So if you look between Abraham and David, there's 750 years gap. David in Babylonian exile is a 400-year gap, and Babylonian exile to Jesus is a 600-year gap, and mathematically this doesn't seem to add up. The counter argument is that it doesn't matter, because what Matthew's trying to get across is symbolic, so he's trying to get across kind of the importance of the number 7, perhaps some would argue, and that it's a sacred number, and that is more important than the accuracy of the generations. And a second reason why this might not matter is that genealogy is, in this context, when Matthew was writing his gospel, it wasn't about being biologically accurate. Not like today, our genealogies are all about sort of tracing accurately back through parents and grandparents, our ancestry. But you could argue that in this time period, what Matthew is trying to get across is God's providence and the links between Abraham, David and Jesus, and therefore it's not meant to be a historical document. It's not meant to be accurate. That's not what Matthew was trying to achieve in making this, and therefore the inaccuracies don't matter. So that would be a counter argument saying, unless you understand why he's making this, then you don't understand why it's written the way it is. So the third problem is that Matthew's birth narratives, it's a point I've already mentioned, emphasises that Jesus was born to a virgin and didn't have a human father. So at this point the question is, why does the genealogy follow Joseph's line? Surely it should follow Mary's line. That would make sense in terms of how the nativity scenes run out. There's a few counter arguments here. Ancient scholars suppose that adoptions and remarriages had occurred, with Matthew recording the biological line. And what it's kind of saying here is that there wasn't ever a name for stepfather, which is what Matthew was probably just trying to do, is trying to sort of take the stepfather line, but there wasn't a word to describe that. So we can't prove as to whether the reason for this is just to do with him being a stepfather. Raymond D. Brown's kind of raises a point that we've already tried to make in the previous section, that this was not meant to be a historical document, an accurate document. Matthew is trying to make religious and political points here about who Jesus is. And in particular, what Raymond E. Brown argues is that Matthew is trying to make a religious claim that the promise God made about the descendants of David and the line of David are being fulfilled. So again, it kind of links to the previous point that Matthew's not making this genealogy to be historically accurate. He's doing it to try and prove that Jesus descends from Abraham and David, and that's the key point. Then the final counter argument is that in the ancient world, adoption was common, and adopted sons were often held in higher esteem than biological sons. And therefore, legally and politically, an adopted child could be just as much as an heir as somebody with a biological link. So again, it's looking at kind of the father-son relationship in a sense in first century Palestine, in the sense that being adopted and not necessarily a biological son didn't mean that that father-son relationship wasn't important, because it really was. So we've got three problems there with Matthew's genealogy, something about the genealogy that just doesn't sit right, but then on the opposite side we have got answers as to why Matthew wrote his genealogy in this way. That then is the end of my short video on Matthew's genealogy of Jesus. Thank you for watching, and make sure you are subscribed if you are not already.